I thought I had earned the right to rest. 50 years of drawings and blueprints of standing on cold job sites at 6 in the morning, of clients who changed their minds twice a week, and contractors who swore the framing would be done by Friday when it never was. I gave all of it my knees, my back, my best years, and at the end of it I had one thing that was truly mine. A lodge on the north shore of Black Pine Lake, deep in the Adirondacks, where the water went silver at dawn, and the pines stood so close together that the wind moved through them like something breathing. I had not just bought that place. I had designed it. I had drawn every beam and every window with my own hand, and I had watched it rise out of the ground the way a mother watches a child learn to stand. It was the one thing I had built for myself and no one else, and for the first time in my life, I did not have to explain it to anyone. I had been away almost 5 months. A firm in Rochester had called me out of retirement for one last consulting project, a civic building they could not seem to finish without someone who remembered how the old codes worked, and I had said yes because it felt like a clean way to close a career. I told myself it would be the last time I set my alarm before sunrise. When the project wrapped, I loaded my car on a Friday afternoon and drove north with nothing planned but silence. I wanted to light the wood stove, make a pot of tea, and sit on the porch until the noise in my head finally went quiet. Grant had been strange those last few weeks. My son, 34 years old, running a landscaping and hardscape company that never quite turned the corner, had always been an easy caller. He phoned to complain, to ask to talk about nothing. But lately his texts had gone short and careful, 1 or 2 words, the kind of answers a person gives when a longer answer would reveal something. Whitney, his wife, had stopped answering me altogether. I told myself people got busy. I told myself I was reading too much into a quiet phone. The road up to the lake was still rutted from the spring rains, and the tires crunched over wet gravel as I climbed, and the smell of pine and cold water came through the vents. And for a few miles I let myself believe I was driving toward peace. Then I came around the last bend before the property, and everything in me stopped. There were 2 cars in my driveway that I did not recognize. A minivan with a bike rack and a small SUV with a rental company sticker in the corner of the windshield. A man I had never seen was carrying a cooler up my porch steps, and a woman was unbuckling 2 small children from the back of the van, and none of them belonged to me. My heart began to move faster, but it was not fear, not yet. It was that old instinct I had learned never to ignore, the one that tells you a wall is out of plumb before the level ever confirms it. I parked behind the SUV and sat there for a moment with my hands on the wheel, trying to make the picture in front of me mean something ordinary. I got out slowly. My legs were steadier than my chest. I walked toward my own front door, and before I reached it, the man with the cooler looked at me with a polite, questioning smile, the smile you give a stranger at a place you believe you have every right to be. That smile bothered me more than anything else because it was mine. It was the look of someone who had been told this was theirs for the weekend. I opened the door without knocking because a person does not knock at her own house, and I stepped into a room I did not recognize. My furniture was still there. The couch I had waited 3 months to find, the reading chair by the window, but everything human had been stripped out of it. My photographs were gone. The wall where my mother had smiled in her garden, where my father had stood in his work clothes, where Grant at 5 years old had gripped the handlebars of his first bicycle, all of it was bare. In their place hung generic framed prints of birch trees and canoes, the kind of art that means nothing so that it can belong to anyone. On the kitchen counter sat a woven basket wrapped in cellophane, a welcome basket with a card tucked into the ribbon. And on the entry table lay a small stapled booklet, and I picked it up, and the cover read, "House Rules the Black Pine Lake House." And beneath that, in a smaller line, "Your hosts, Whitney and the Delaney family." The woman with the children came in behind me and stopped when she saw my face. She could tell the way people can that something was wrong. I set the booklet down and picked up a spiral calendar that sat beside it, and I opened it, and the pages were full. Names and dates in tidy handwriting, weekend after weekend, going back through the summer and forward into the fall. Deposits marked as received. A column of dollar amounts. My lodge, my sanctuary, the one place I had built for myself, had been rented out to strangers for months, and every dollar of it had gone into a hand that was not mine. I heard the back door open, and then I heard her voice before I saw her. Whitney came in from the deck with a stack of clean towels over one arm, and she stopped when she saw me, and her face did the thing I would remember for a long time afterward. It did not fill with surprise or shame. It filled with annoyance. I was an interruption. I was a problem that had arrived at an inconvenient hour. She set the towels down on the counter with a small, deliberate thud and crossed her arms. "What are you doing here?" she said. It was not a question so much as a complaint. "This is my house," I said. My voice came out quieter than I expected and steadier. "The question is what all of these people are doing in it." The woman with the children looked from me to Whitney and back again, and I watched the first thread of doubt cross her face. Behind me, the man had come to the doorway with his cooler still in his hands. "These are my guests," Whitney said, lifting her chin. "They have a reservation. You cannot just walk in here and start bothering paying guests. I will call the police." "Guests," I said. "You have been gone for months." She said it as though my absence were a lease I had signed. "You were traveling. You told Grant you did not care what happened up here. We are managing the property. That is all. There is nothing for you to be upset about." I had not told Grant any such thing. I had told my son I was finishing a job in Rochester and would drive up to the lake when it was done. I had never given anyone permission to so much as change a light bulb, let alone hang strangers on my walls and pocket their money. And there it was, the shape of the lie already built and furnished and lived in before I ever walked through the door. She had a story ready, and in that story I was the confused woman who had wandered in to make a scene. Grant came in then. He had been outside somewhere, and he stopped a few feet inside the room, and the color went out of his face the way it used to when he was a boy, and knew he had broken something he could not put back. He looked at me, and he could not hold it, and his eyes went to the floor. "Mom," he said. That was all, just the one word and then nothing. Whitney's parents came in behind him, Dale and Corinne, two people I had met only a handful of times and never warmed to. Dale was a heavy man who spoke as though he expected the room to wait for him. Corinne was thin and quick-eyed with that particular expression of a person who has decided in advance that she is the injured party. They took up positions near the fireplace, and Dale folded his arms, and neither of them said a word. And the silence of the two of them told me more than any speech could have. They were not surprised to be there. This was not their first weekend at my lake. "Whitney," I said, keeping my voice level, "I want you to look at these people." I turned to the woman and the man with the cooler who were standing now in an unhappy cluster near the door. "Did you pay to be here this weekend?" The woman glanced at Whitney, then made a decision. "We did," she said. "We booked it back in August, Kevin and Renee Prescott. We paid a deposit and the balance last week. Is there some kind of problem? Because if there is a problem with the reservation, I would like to know now. We drove 4 hours with 2 kids in the car. There is a problem," I said gently, because none of this was their fault. "But it is not with you." "Do not listen to her," Whitney said sharply. "She is my husband's mother, and she has some kind of grievance, and she is trying to ruin your vacation. I am calling the police right now." She pulled her phone from her back pocket and held it up like a weapon. "You can explain to them why you barged into an occupied rental and started harassing a family with small children." I felt something settle in me, then something cold and clear and almost peaceful. I had spent a great many years bracing for confrontations like this, and I had always imagined I would shake or weep or fold. Instead, I felt the strange calm of a person who has finally arrived at the exact place she needs to be. I walked past Whitney, past Grant, and I sat down in my own reading chair by the window and folded my hands in my lap. "Please do," I said. "Call them. I will wait." That stopped her. She had expected me to run, to shrink, to apologize my way backward out the door, and instead I had made myself comfortable in my own home and invited the authorities to come. Her thumb hovered over the screen. Grant put a hand on her arm and murmured something, and she shook him off without looking at him. "Do not touch me," she said. "Someone in this family has to have a spine." And she dialed. She put it on speaker, I think, so that everyone would hear how frightened and reasonable she was. And a dispatcher answered, and Whitney described a disturbance, an agitated older woman who had forced her way into an occupied home and was threatening her guests. She gave the mile marker. She said we do not know what she might do. She seems confused. She let her voice tremble at the edges in a way that would have been convincing to anyone who could not see her face. I sat in my chair and let her finish because every word she spoke was a word she would have to account for very soon. The Prescotts had drawn their children close and were whispering to each other by the door, and I could see the calculation moving across their faces, the slow understanding that they had walked into something that was not what it had been sold as. Kevin Prescott caught my eye once, and I gave him a small nod, the only reassurance I could offer, which was that he had not done anything wrong. We waited. Dale poured himself a glass of water from my tap and drank it standing up. Corinne sat on the arm of the couch. Grant stood by the cold fireplace with his head down and his hands pushed deep into his pockets, and he did not look at me, and he did not look at his wife. And I understood that my son had known about all of this and had said nothing, and that the knowing was going to cost him more than he yet realized. It was nearly 40 minutes before I heard the tires on the gravel. A county sheriff's vehicle pulled in behind the rental car, and 2 deputies got out an older man with a heavy build and a gray mustache, and a younger woman with a notebook in her hand. Whitney was at the door before they reached the steps, pulling it open, arranging her face into relief. "Thank you for coming," she said. "She is inside. She came in without permission, and she will not leave, and she is frightening my guests." The older deputy came in first and let his eyes move around the room, taking the measure of it. The strangers by the door, the man by the fireplace, the older woman sitting quietly in the chair. His nameplate read Kearns. The younger one, Hollis, stayed near the entrance with her notebook. "All right," Kearns said in the even tone of a man who has broken up 100 family arguments and expects this to be the 101st. "Who owns this property?" Whitney opened her mouth, but I stood up before she could speak. "I do," I said. "My name is Elaine Radcliffe. This is my property. I designed it, I built it, and I hold the deed." "That is not true," Whitney said at once. "She is my husband's mother. We manage this place. She has been gone for months, and she showed up out of nowhere to cause a scene." Kearns looked at me the way I had been looked at before more times than I could count. It was the look that had already sorted the room that had decided the younger and more forceful woman was probably the reliable one, and the older woman was probably muddled. It was the look that assumes a gray-haired woman in a chair is a problem to be managed rather than a person to be believed. "Ma'am," he said to me not unkindly, "do you have anything that shows ownership of the properties?" "I do," I said. "It is in my bag by the door where I set it when I came in." Hollis retrieved the bag and handed it to me, and I opened it and took out the folder I had carried up from the city, the folder I carried everywhere, because a lifetime of building things had taught me to keep my papers close. Inside was the deed to the lodge, the most recent property tax bill, the utility statements in my name, and the final letter from the bank confirming the construction loan had been paid in full 3 years ago. I handed the folder to Kearns, and he opened it and began to read slowly, the way a careful man reads, turning each page and checking the name and the address against the woman standing in front of him. His face changed as he read. The younger deputy stepped closer to look over his shoulder, and the 2 of them exchanged a glance that I had been waiting for without knowing it. "This is all in your name," Kearns said, and when he looked up at me now, it was a different look entirely. He turned to Whitney. "Ma'am, according to these documents, Mrs. Radcliffe is the sole owner of record. There is no other name on this deed." The color left Whitney's face. Dale set his water glass down on the counter hard enough that it rang. Corinne made a small sound. Grant closed his eyes. "But he is her son," Whitney said, and her voice had climbed. "Grant, tell them. We had permission." She said she did not care what we did up here. I said no such thing. I said, and I did not raise my voice, and somehow that made it land harder. "I have not been to this house in almost 5 months. I was working out of Rochester. I came home today to rest, and I found strangers on my walls and my own family renting my house to people I have never met." I looked at Kearns. "I never gave anyone permission to occupy this property, and I certainly never gave anyone permission to rent it out for money." The younger Deputy Hollis had begun writing in her notebook. She turned to Whitney with a professional steadiness. "Ma'am, the fact that your husband is the owner's son does not give him the right to use the property without the owner's consent, and it does not give anyone the right to rent it out. Mrs. Radcliffe says she never authorized any of this." That was when Kevin Prescott stepped forward holding his phone, and his face had gone tight. "I want to understand what is happening here," he said, "because I booked this house through a rental site. I have a confirmation. I paid a deposit, and I paid the balance. If this is not even the owner's listing, then what did I pay for?" He looked at Whitney, and his voice hardened. "Whose account did that money go into?" Whitney did not answer him. She looked at Grant, and Grant looked at the floor, and the answer sat in that silence for everyone to read. "Sir," Kearns said to Kevin, "I would strongly recommend you contact the platform you booked through and start a dispute this evening and keep every record you have. If the person who listed this property did not have the authority to rent it, you have grounds to get your money back, and you may want to file a report as well. This may be more than a mix-up." He turned back to the room. "As for tonight, this is the owner's home, and she has asked that it be vacated. I would suggest everyone gather their belongings." "You cannot throw us out," Dale said, finding his voice at last low and affronted. It is late. We have nowhere to be. No one is throwing anyone out onto the road tonight in the sense you mean, Kern said evenly. But this property belongs to Mrs. Radcliffe. She is present, and she is asking you to leave it. You do not have a right to remain here over the owner's objection. You can collect your things and go. He looked at the Prescotts, and his voice softened. You folks were misled, and I am sorry for it. There is a motel about 20 minutes back toward the highway if you need somewhere for the night. Save all your paperwork. Renee Prescott was already gathering the children's things, her mouth set in a hard line, and I saw her glance at Whitney with an expression that needed no words. Kevin was on his phone pulling up the booking. Within a few minutes, they had their coolers and their bags and their 2 tired children, and Kevin stopped in front of me on his way out. I am sorry we walked into the middle of this, he said quietly. I hope you get it sorted. You have nothing to be sorry for, I told him. Keep every record. Get your money back. And I am sorry your weekend was ruined by people who had no right to sell it to you. They left. The van backed out, and the headlights swung across the dark trees, and then the road took them, and the sound of the engine faded, and the lodge was left to the 6 of us, and the tension that filled it like water filling a room. Whitney was still holding her phone. Grant had not moved from the fireplace. Dale and Corinne stood near the kitchen with the wary stillness of people who had felt the ground shift and were not yet sure how far they would fall. The deputies lingered a moment longer, and Kearns handed me back my folder and told me to call the department if anyone refused to leave, or if the situation escalated, and I thanked him, and the 2 of them went out to their vehicle, though they did not immediately drive away. I did not sit back down. I walked to the counter where Whitney had set her stack of towels, and beside it lay her open laptop, the screen still glowing. I turned it toward me. She started forward and then stopped because there was nothing she could say that would make it better to touch it in front of me. On the screen was the host dashboard for the rental listing. My lake, my lodge. Photographs of my own rooms taken carefully to hide the empty frames on the walls. A calendar that ran green with booked nights weekend after weekend deep into the coming weeks. A deposit total that made my breath catch. And beneath the property title listed as a co-host with a small circular photograph pulled from somewhere I did not remember was my own name. Elaine Radcliffe, as though I had blessed the whole thing, as though I had lent it my face. I scrolled slowly, and Whitney watched me do it and said nothing. There was a linked utility account for the lodge that I had never opened, set up in the spring in my name with an address and an account number I did not recognize. There were message threads with dozens of strangers, all of them believing they were speaking to the owner, all of them thanking me for the lovely home. This was no longer a rude weekend. This was no longer a family who had overstepped. My name had been used. My identity had been spent like a thing found on the ground. And as I stood there in the quiet of the house I had built with my own hands, I understood that whatever came next would not be an argument. It would be a reckoning, and for the first time in my life I was ready to see it through. I closed the laptop and slid it across the counter toward Whitney, and I told all 4 of them to gather their things and leave my property, and I said it in the flat, unhurried voice of a woman who no longer needed anyone in the room to agree with her. They went. Dale muttered about the hour and the cold, and Corinne dabbed at eyes that were not wet, and Whitney moved through the house, snatching up towels and toiletries and a phone charger with quick, furious hands, and Grant carried the bags out to the cars without once meeting my eyes. Within 20 minutes, the driveway was empty, and the taillights were gone down the gravel, and I stood alone in the middle of my own living room with the wood stove cold and the walls bare, and the welcome basket still sitting on my counter with its ribbon and its lying little card. I did not cry that night, though I had expected to. I made a pot of tea and I sat in my reading chair, and I let the size of the thing settle over me slowly, the way the cold comes into a house after the fire goes out. It was one thing to picture Grant and Whitney letting themselves in for a weekend they had no right to. That would have been a hurt I could have swallowed the way I had swallowed so many others. But this was not that. This was months of my home sold to strangers for money that went into their pockets. This was my face on a listing, and my name on a utility account I had never opened. Somewhere in the spring, while I was in Rochester, finishing drawings for a building that was not even mine, my daughter-in-law had sat at a keyboard and typed my name into a form as though it belonged to her, and my son had known, and neither of them had thought I would ever find out. I understood sitting there that the money mattered less to me than the name. I had given this family a great deal of money over the years. I was not a wealthy woman, but I had been a careful one. And careful people accumulate quietly. When Grant started his landscaping company 4 years ago, he had come to me with a business plan that was really just a wish, and I had not simply handed him cash the way I had when he was younger and everything was a crisis. I had learned that lesson the slow way. Instead, I had done it properly. I had loaned him the startup money as a secured note drawn up by a lawyer with his equipment and his truck as collateral, and I had made him sign it, and he had signed it with the wounded look of a boy whose mother did not trust him. I had told him then that the trust was in the paper, not in the promise, and that this was how adults did business. He had not liked it, but he had signed. And the house they lived in, the modest 2-bedroom on Coulter Street across the county, that house was mine as well. I had bought it outright when the market was low, meaning to rent it out for income in my retirement, and when Grant and Whitney could not manage a place of their own, I had let them live in it. Not for free, exactly. I am not a fool, whatever Whitney believed. I had drawn up a simple written lease and charged them a token rent of a few $100s a month, far below what the house could command, because I told myself it was better to have my son housed and stable than to squeeze him for market rate. I had signed that lease as the landlord. He had signed it as the tenant. It was a real tenancy on paper and ink, and at the time I had thought of it only as kindness. I did not yet understand that I was building without meaning to the exact instruments I would one day need, because that was the truth of it. The thing that came to me in the small hours as the tea went cold. I was not helpless. I had spent a lifetime believing that love meant making myself available without limit, that a mother's job was to be the floor beneath her child, no matter how hard he stamped on it. But I was also a woman who kept her papers in a folder and carried them everywhere. I held the deed to the lodge. I held the note on the business. I held the lease on the house. When Whitney had looked at me across my own living room and called me a confused old woman, she had made the same mistake the deputy nearly made. She had seen the gray hair and missed the architect. Every load-bearing wall in her comfortable life ran straight back to me, and she had never once thought to ask what would happen if I decided to stop holding them up. In the morning, I drove down the mountain, and I did not go home to brood. I went to see Ruth Ellison. Ruth had done my legal work for 15 years, the closing on the lake property, the note for Grant's business, the lease on Coulter Street, my will. She was a small, precise woman near my own age, who wore reading glasses on a chain and had never once in 15 years told me what I wanted to hear when the truth was something else. I sat across from her at her cluttered desk and I laid it all out. The drive up the strangers, the listing the calendar full of booked nights, the deputies, and finally the co-host photograph and the utility account in my name. Ruth listened without interrupting, and when I finished, she took off her glasses and let them fall to the end of their chain. "Elaine," she said, "I need you to separate two things in your mind because they are going to move at different speeds. There is what you feel, and there is what you can do. What you feel is enormous, and you are entitled to every ounce of it. What you can do is narrower, and it is powerful precisely because it is narrow. Let us not confuse the two, and let us not do anything tonight that we cannot stand behind in 6 months." "I am not going to do anything tonight," I said. "I did my something last night. I sat in my chair and I let her call the police, and I watched it fall apart on her. What I want to know from you is what is real. What can I actually do, and what am I not allowed to do?" She put her glasses back on and began in her careful way to draw the map. The listing was the simplest and the most urgent, she said. Whether or not Whitney had committed a crime by using my name was not for me to decide, and not for me to pursue on my own. My job was to shut off the harm and protect my identity, and I could do that immediately. I could contact the rental platform, provide the deed, proving I was the sole owner, and demand the listing be removed, and my name stripped from it as a co-host. I could sign a sworn statement that I had never authorized the listing, the co-host designation, or the use of my name, and that any bookings had been made without my knowledge or consent. That statement would protect me, and it would also make clear to the platform and to any guest that the money had never been mine. As for the utility account opened in my name, I could report it to the utility company as fraudulent freeze-it and place alerts on my credit. And if there had been genuine identity theft, and Ruth said the word carefully because it is a legal thing and not just an insult, then I could report it to law enforcement and let them decide what to do with it. What I could not do, she said, was appoint myself judge and jury. I would not be knocking on Whitney's door with an ultimatum about jail. I would report what happened, hand it to the people whose job it was, and let the process be the process. "I do not want to put her in jail," I said, and I was a little surprised to find it was true. "I want my name off of everything of hers. I want to stop paying for a life that treats me like a stranger. That is all." "Then let us talk about the paying," Ruth said, and she pulled a legal pad toward her. The house on Coulter Street was the piece that could move the most and hurt the most, and so it was the piece we handled the most carefully. I was the landlord. Grant and Whitney were my tenants under a written lease. I could end that tenancy, but I could not do it the way Whitney had tried to do things on a whim with a raised voice. New York gives tenants time, and the amount of time depends on how long they have lived there. And Grant and Whitney had lived on Coulter Street for years, which meant the law required a long written notice, 90 days delivered properly before the tenancy could end. 90 days, not 30 minutes, not a weekend. Ruth was emphatic about this, and I was glad of it, because I did not want to become the thing I was standing against. I would give them every single day the law required, and not one day less, and I would do it in writing through her office, so that no one could ever say I had thrown my son into the street. You understand what that notice means, though, Ruth said, watching me over the glasses. Once it is served, you have said the words out loud. You will be ending the arrangement that has kept them housed below market for years. Whatever cushion that gave them goes away in 90 days. Is that what you want? It is what I want, I said. I am not putting them out tonight. I am telling them the free ride ends in the spring, and they have 3 months to become adults about it. If they use those 3 months, they land on their feet. If they do not, that is a choice they will have made with their eyes open. The note on the business was the second lever, and it was cleaner because it was pure contract. Grant had borrowed startup money from me on a secured note with a payment schedule, and he had been behind on it for the better part of a year. I had let it slide month after month the way I had let everything slide because he was my son, and the paper felt like a threat I would never actually use. But it was a real note, and the terms were the terms. Ruth explained that I did not have to keep carrying a defaulted loan out of sentiment. I could send a formal notice that the loan was in default and call the balance due, giving him the time the contract specified to cure it or to refinance the debt somewhere else on his own credit. I was not seizing his truck in the night. I was doing what any lender does when a borrower stops paying, which is to stop pretending the payments do not matter. If he could not pay and could not refinance, then the collateral was the collateral, and that too would follow a process with notice and time built into every step. None of this is fast, Ruth said. That is the part people never believe. In the movies, someone signs a paper and a family is on the street by morning. In real life, it is notices and waiting periods and certified mail, and more waiting. You are not going to wake up next week and find them ruined. You are going to send some letters, and then months are going to pass, and the consequences are going to arrive slowly in their own time. If you cannot live with slow, do not start. Slow is fine, I said. Slow gives them room to do the right thing. I am not trying to destroy anyone, Ruth. I am trying to stop being the reason none of them ever has to grow up. We spent the rest of that morning turning feelings into paper. Ruth drafted the sworn statement about the listing in my name. She prepared the 90-day notice for Coulter Street. She wrote the default and demand letter on the business note with the cure period spelled out to the day. She gave me a checklist for the utility company and the credit bureaus, and told me exactly what to say and what not to say, and she told me more than once to keep every record and to route every hard conversation through her office, so that I never said anything in anger that could be used to make me the villain later. I signed what needed signing. I left her office a little after noon with copies in my folder, and for the first time since I had come around that bend and seen the strange cars in my driveway, I felt the ground under my feet. Then I did the quiet work, the work that had no drama in it. I called the rental platform and spent an hour on hold and another hour explaining, and I sent them the deed and the sworn statement, and by the end of the week the listing was gone, and my name was gone from it, and the future bookings had been canceled, and those guests, whoever they were, would get their money back from the platform, not from me, because I had never held a dollar of it. I called the utility company and reported the account, and they froze it and opened a fraud case. I placed alerts on my credit, and I made a report with the sheriff's department, factual and unemotional, and handed them the printouts and the account number and the dates, and I let them decide what it was worth because that was their job and not mine. I did not call Grant. I did not call Whitney. I let the letters do the talking because I had learned at last that the letters were stronger than I was. The notices went out by certified mail from Ruth's office on a Thursday. On Saturday, my phone began to ring. I did not answer the first calls or the second or the fifth. I let them go and I read the voicemails as transcripts so I would not have to hear the voices, and the voices were exactly what I expected. Whitney disbelieving then, furious. Dale affronted speaking of gratitude and family as though those were bills I had failed to pay. Corinne weeping, invoking her age and her husband's heart and the cruelty of a woman who would do this to her own blood. And Grant saying almost nothing, just, "Mom, please call me," over and over in a voice that got smaller each time. The confrontation I could not avoid came the following week, and it came at my insistence in Ruth's conference room with Ruth present, because I would not do it at my own table where the old habits lived. They came, all four of them. Whitney sat across the table with her arms crossed and her chin up still, even now certain that the right combination of anger and grievance would make me fold as I always had. Dale and Corinne sat on either side of her like a wall. Grant sat a little apart at the end, and he looked like a man who had not slept. Whitney started before Ruth had finished sitting down. She said the notice was insane, that Grant was my son, that I was tearing a family apart over a misunderstanding, that no reasonable person rents out an empty house and calls it a crime that they had been maintaining the property. And honestly, I should be thanking them. She had a great deal to say, and she said it fast the way people do when they are trying to outrun the moment they know is coming. I let her finish. Then I opened my folder. "You listed my house without my knowledge," I said quietly. "You took money from strangers for months. You put my name on the listing as a co-host, and you opened a utility account in my name that I never authorized. Those last two things are not rudeness, Whitney. They are my name used as if it were yours, and I have reported them to the people whose job it is to look at things like that. I am not here to threaten you with any of that. I am not a prosecutor, and I would not want to be. I have handed it over, and it is out of my hands now, which should frighten you more than anything I could say." I laid the copies on the table one at a time, the way I had once laid drawings in front of clients, so that no one could pretend not to have seen them. The letter to the platform, the sworn statement, the report to the utility company, and then the two that landed hardest, the 90-day notice on Coulter Street and the default letter on the business note. "This is not me putting you out," I said. "Read the dates. You have 90 days on the house. That is the law, and I am giving you every day of it. And this," I touched the note, "is a loan you signed and have not paid in almost a year. I carried it in silence because you are my son's wife and he is my son. I am done carrying it in silence. The balance is called. You have the cure period in the contract to pay it or to refinance it on your own. That is all standard. Any bank would do the same. The only thing that has changed is that I have stopped pretending the paper does not mean what it says." The room was very quiet. Dale's face had gone a dull red. Corinne had her hand over her mouth. And Whitney, for the first time since I had known her, had nothing ready to say. The confidence that had carried her through the police call, and the accusations, and the certainty that I would break, simply ran out all at once like water from a cracked glass, and left her staring at the papers with the dawning understanding that this was not a threat she could argue her way past. It had already been done. There was nothing to negotiate. There were only dates on certified letters, and a process that would take its time and could not be shouted down. It was Grant who broke. He had said nothing the whole time, and now he put his face in his hands and his shoulders shook, and when he finally looked up, his eyes were wet, and he was looking at me and not at his wife. "I told her not to use your name," he said. His voice cracked in half. "I told her. The house, the rentals, I let it happen, I did. I am not saying I did not, but the account, the co-host thing, I told her that was too far, and she did it anyway, and I did not stop her, and I should have. And I am so sorry, Mom. I am so ashamed I can hardly look at you." "You let all of it happen, Grant," I said. And I did not soften it, because softening it was the mistake I had made his whole life. "You knew, and you stayed quiet, and you let her call me a confused old woman in the house I built. Being sorry now is not nothing, but it is not enough yet, and it is going to be a long time before it is." And that was when this wall between them cracked in front of me. Whitney turned on Grant right there at Ruth's table and hissed that this was his family, his problem, that she had married a man who could not provide and could not stand up to his own mother. And Grant said her parents were living in our house, eating food we could not afford. And where was her contribution? And Dale surged up out of his chair, and Ruth said calmly and firmly that this meeting was over, and I gathered my folder and stood, because I did not need to hear the rest. I had seen what I needed to see. The thing that had held them together was never love, or not only love. It was my money quietly holding up the floor. And now that I had stopped, the floor was showing them exactly what it had been resting on all along. I walked out of Ruth's office into a bright, cold afternoon, and behind me I could still hear their voices rising against each other, and I did not turn around. I got into my car and I drove north toward the lake, toward the house I had built with my own hands, and for the length of that long, quiet drive, I felt no triumph, and no guilt either, only the strange, clean ache of a woman who has finally set down a weight she has carried so long she had forgotten it was not part of her body. The consequences did not arrive the way people imagine consequences arrive. There was no single terrible morning. There was instead the slow turning of a season, and I lived through it at the lake alone, watching the leaves go from green to rust to bare, while the certified letters did their quiet work down in the valley. The first weeks after the meeting in Ruth's office were almost eerily silent. The calls stopped. The voicemails stopped. I think Whitney had finally understood that shouting at me only put more words on a record she did not want to build, and so she went quiet, and the quiet was its own kind of information. I did not fill it. I hung my photographs back on the walls, one by one, my mother in her garden, and my father in his work clothes, and Grant at 5 years old on his first bicycle. And each frame I set back in its place was a small act of return, a reclaiming of the space that had been emptied of me. I chopped wood. I walked the shoreline in the cold mornings until my face went numb. I slept without waking at 3 in the morning to worry about someone else's bills, and I had not done that in years, and I had forgotten what it felt like to be that rested. The news of what was happening reached me in pieces, mostly through Grant, who had started sending me long, careful messages that I read but did not answer. I did not answer them because I did not trust yet that anything had changed, and because I had spent a lifetime rushing to reassure him, and I was determined this once to let a silence stand long enough for something real to grow in it. So I read and I watched the story unfold from a distance the way you watch weather move across a valley from a high porch. The business note came due first because contracts move faster than tenancies. Grant could not pay the balance, and he could not refinance it because a lender looks at a year of missed payments and sees exactly what it is. Ruth had been right that nothing was fast, but nothing stopped either. He met with me once about it in Ruth's office again, and this time he came without Whitney, and he did not argue. He told me he was going to wind the company down rather than let it collapse into something worse, that he would sell the good equipment to pay down what he owed me and return the truck that had served as collateral, and he asked me quietly whether there was any version of a repayment plan for the rest that would let him keep his dignity. And I looked at him, and I saw that he had asked the question the way an adult asks it, without tears and without a story about how unfair the world was, and I told Ruth to work out a plan he could actually meet, small monthly amounts over a long time in writing signed. Not because I needed the money back, because he needed to pay it. The house on Coulter Street moved at the pace the law required, which is to say slowly. The 90-day notice ran its full course every day of it, and I did not shave a single one off in either direction. In the last weeks of it, Whitney's parents left first. Dale and Corinne could not have made the numbers work in that house without the invisible subsidy of my below-market rent, and once they understood the rent itself was ending, they understood there was no house to stay in, and they found a room to rent in a shared house 2 towns over a small place. Nothing like what they had grown used to. Corinne called me once during that stretch, not to shout this time, but to plead to tell me about Dale's heart and their age, and how frightened they were. And I listened, and I told her as kindly as I could, and as firmly as I had ever told her anything, that I was 63 years old myself, and that no one had ever set up a subsidy to protect my old age. That I had built my security the slow, hard way, and that I could not and would not spend it holding up 4 other adults who had treated me as furniture. She hung up crying. I did not call back. It was not cruelty. It was the first honest boundary I had ever drawn with that family, and honest things are often mistaken for cruel ones by people who have only ever known indulgence. Grant lost his footing hard in those months, and I will not pretend it did not hurt to watch. With the company gone, he took whatever work he could find, and what he found was a night shift loading freight at a distribution center for an hourly wage that would not have covered a fraction of the life he used to live. He and Whitney gave up the Coulter Street house when the notice expired and moved into a small 1-bedroom apartment in a plain part of town, and they sold most of their furniture to cover the deposit, and Whitney took a second job cleaning offices in the evenings, because 2 incomes stretched thin were the only way the arithmetic worked at all. I heard all of this in Grant's messages stated plainly without accusation, which was itself a kind of miracle. The old Grant would have made every hardship a bill presented to me for payment. This Grant simply told me what was true and did not ask me to fix it. The marriage very nearly did not survive it. I learned later that there had been a stretch, sometime around the coldest part of the winter, when Whitney had packed a bag and gone back to whatever her parents had, and Grant had been alone in that little apartment for the better part of a month, working nights and coming home to nothing, and had sat in the dark more than once, wondering whether he had lost everything for good. I did not know it while it was happening. I only knew it afterward when he told me, and the telling of it was one of the honest things that eventually made me begin to believe. But the thing that turned it, the thing that reached me in a way no message from Grant ever could have, did not come from Grant at all. It came in the middle of February on an afternoon when the lake had frozen white and hard, and the snow lay deep on the pines, and my phone rang with a number I did not know, and I answered it because something told me to. It was Renee Prescott, the mother from the minivan, the family with the 2 small children who had driven 4 hours into the middle of my nightmare and been sent to a motel. I had not heard her voice since that first evening, and it took me a moment to place it. She apologized for calling out of nowhere. She said she had gotten my number from the rental platform during the dispute, and that she had gone back and forth about whether to reach out, and that in the end she felt I ought to know something. She told me that a few weeks earlier Grant had contacted them. Not the platform, not a lawyer, Grant himself. He had found them, and he had written them a long message, apologizing for what had happened, taking responsibility for the whole thing without excuses, and then he had done something that stopped my breath in my chest. The platform had refunded the Prescotts their booking money, so they were not out of pocket for the reservation itself. But they had spent money that night on the motel, and on gas, and on a ruined weekend they had saved for small amounts that no company was ever going to give back. And Grant, out of a night shift wage that could not spare it, had insisted on paying them back for every dollar of it. He had mailed them a money order, Renee said, with a note that said he knew it did not fix anything, but that it was the only right thing he could think to do. I did not have to tell you this, Renee said. He did not ask me to. I do not even think he would want you to know. But I have a mother, and if my child ever did something like this, and then tried to make it right when no one was making him, I would want someone to tell me, so I'm telling you. Whatever happened in your family, he is trying. I thought you should hear it from someone who has no reason to lie to you. I thanked her, and I do not entirely remember what I said after that, because I was crying by the end of it quietly the way you cry when something you had stopped hoping for turns out to be real after all. Because I knew what that money order meant in a way Renee could not. I knew what a night shift wage was worth to a man who had lost everything. I knew that there had been no audience for it, no way for it to win him anything, no mother watching to be impressed. He had done it in the dark for strangers out of almost nothing for the single reason that it was right. And a man does not do that unless something in him has actually changed. There was one more piece, and it came from a man named Nathan Reeves, a financial counselor Grant had gone to on his own. Reeves called me with Grant's permission not to ask me for anything, but because part of his work was helping families understand what had happened to them, and he thought I should know that when Grant had first sat down across from him, and they had added up on paper everything Grant had taken from me over the years, all of it in one column for the first time. Grant had wept. Not for the house, Reeves said, not for the truck, or the company. He wept because he had never once seen the whole number before, had never let himself see it, and seeing it laid out in a single honest sum had broken something loose in him that needed to break. Reeves told me he had counseled Grant that the worst thing that could happen now would be for me to step in and rescue him, that this hard season was the thing that was finally teaching him what a lifetime of my help had prevented him from learning. And then Reeves said something I have kept. He said that he worked with a great many parents who had to make the kind of decision I had made, and that even when it was the right one, it never stopped hurting, and that he wanted me to know that, from the outside, from a professional who had no reason to flatter me, what I had done looked less like abandonment and more like the only real gift I had ever given my son. Spring came late to the lake that year. The ice went out of the bay in April with a sound like distant thunder, and the first green came back to the birches. And I opened the windows and let the smell of the thaw move through the house that was mine again. Wholly mine, every wall and every window. And it was around then, when the worst of it had passed and the shape of their new smaller life had settled into something they could actually stand on, that Grant asked through Ruth whether I would be willing to speak with him. Not a demand. A request routed properly with room in it for me to say no. I said yes. We met at a diner halfway between the lake and the town neutral ground, a booth by the window, coffee neither of us drank. He looked older. The softness had gone out of his face and left something more solid behind it, and his hands were rough in a way a landscaper's hands get, and an office worker's do not. And when he sat down across from me, he did not reach for my hand or make a speech. He just looked at me for a long moment, and then he said simply, "Thank you." For what, I said, because I needed to hear him say it. "For not saving me," he said. "For letting me fall. I have spent my whole life landing on you, and I never once felt the ground. And I never knew what it cost you to be the ground, and now I do. I know what a night shift feels like. I know what it is to add up what you spend and have it not be enough and have no one to call. You lived like that for years so that I would never have to, and I took it. And I called it love, and I let my wife put your name on a listing, and I said nothing." His voice held steady, which was new. "I am not here to ask you for anything. I do not want anything from you. I just needed to say it to your face. I am sorry. And thank you. Both of those things, and I know they are years too late." I looked at my son across that table, and I saw the boy on the bicycle, and I saw the man his hardship had made him into, and I felt the whole long pull of a mother's love that wanted even now, even after everything, to tell him it was all right to sweep it away to make it easy. And I did not do it. Because the not doing was the love now. That was the thing I had finally learned. "I believe you are trying," I said. "I can see that you are, and that matters more to me than you know. But I am not going to tell you that everything is fine, because everything is not fine yet, and pretending it is would only teach you the old lesson one more time. Forgiveness is not a check I write once and hand across a table. It is something that gets built slowly out of years of you being the man you are trying to be right now, on a day when it is hard and no one is watching. If you keep being that man, then we will keep talking, and one day we will not be counting the years anymore. But it will be on my terms, with my boundaries, and with my dignity kept whole. I will not go back to being the floor. Not for you, not for anyone, ever again." He nodded, and there were tears in his eyes, but he did not use them to ask for anything, which was how I knew they were real. And we sat there a while longer in the ordinary light of that diner, not fixing anything, just two adults at the beginning of something that might, with time and work, become a real relationship between equals instead of the thing it had been. I drove back to the lake that afternoon with the windows down. Whitney sent a message a few days later, brief and without demands, saying only that I had been right about all of it, and that she did not expect forgiveness, but wanted me to know she understood now what it had cost me, and that if the day ever came, they would be working to deserve it, and if it never came, they would understand that too. I read it twice, and I put it away, and I did not answer, not out of cruelty, but because I had nothing to say yet that would be true, and I was done saying things that were not. That evening, I sat on my porch above Black Pine Lake and watched the last light go gold and then gray on the water I had built my life to look at. I was 63 years old. I had raised a son and lost myself in the raising, and very nearly let myself be erased from my own walls by people who mistook my love for a resource with no bottom. And I had said no. Late, but not too late. I had drawn a line and held it, and the holding had cost me a season of grief and had given me back a life. Somewhere down in the valley, my son was loading freight in the dark and learning at 34 the thing I could never teach him by rescuing him, which was that he could stand. And up here, the water went dark and still, and the pines closed around the quiet, and I sat in the house that was mine, wholly mine, and I understood at last that loving someone does not mean disappearing into them, that being a mother was never meant to mean being a martyr, and that the truest thing I had ever done for my son was to finally at long last refuse to be destroyed for his comfort. That was not selfishness. That was love. The kind that teaches instead of enables, the kind that holds a line instead of holding up a floor, and for the first time in my long life, it was a love I had learned to give myself as well.